First on our recurring agenda, any new faces? I recognize all of these faces. So I'm going to assume that we don't have any new faces today. And we can move on to outstanding project level RFCs. I will share my screen here. Okie dokie. Semantic versioning RFC. This has one approval. It looks like we are waiting on Orion. Is there anything else we need to discuss on this RFC today? I'm going to take that as a note. Moving on to build pack list builders. Frankie, is there anything that we should be talking about today with regard to the build pack list builders?
Nothing new, just like the one outstanding concern was around like how could we actually implement releasing the build pack list builders from the same repos as their pack full counterparts. There's an example repo that demonstrates how this is possible with tooling that we already use in the project. Now just waiting on approvals given said implementation.
Okie dokie. Moving on to the build materials RFC.
Yep, I can speak to this. We're just waiting for more feedback. If anybody has anything, nothing major there.
Okie dokie. Everyone, please re-review the bill of materials RFC. I know this is on my list of things I need to re-review. IBM Liberty Build Pack. I finally got a chance to go through this in more detail. I did have a couple questions. I was wondering if we can move this one to the formal agenda today. Does that work for you, Kevin?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, so we will come back to this one and complete Git build pack support. This is not an RFC. This is just updating the status, so we don't need to talk about that right now. Okay. So moving on to, here, let me put the Liberty build pack at the end of the agenda here. Moving on to language specific RFCs. We have one that is a draft whip RFC. Is this?
No updates here as of now. We've kind of been distracted by the movements in the core team or the core team right now. So should be getting back to this soon, hopefully.
There's been some interesting activity on the .NET Core build pack, like some folks opening issues about other types of configuration that they want that might point to a reasonable implementation that addresses this, if I like remember the underlying context here. So just check out the open issues, I think on the language family, and you'll see, I think, what I'm talking about there.
Gotcha. Will do.
Okay. So I think that's all we had for language specific RFCs. So now we can talk about the Liberty build pack real quickly. I finally had a chance to look at this in more detail, and I just had a couple questions. I think maybe the first one I want to talk about is the case of a package server.
Yeah.
So I assume that's when you're like building into like a zip file, like packaging your application?
It's packaging an application with the Liberty configuration. It's not the Liberty runtime. It's just a zip file that contains the app and the config.
I was wondering, so sort of the way that other Java build packs work right now is that whenever you have a application package, either because a build tool build pack like Maven or Gradle created it as part of the build, or because the user directly provided it to pack, before it would make it to this build pack, it would be expanded. So like at the end of the Maven build pack, it will be looking for generated artifact and sort of replacing what's in the app directory with the expanded archive. Or if you were directly, CF pushing in CF for Kates or pack building an archive, sort of the first step the platform would do is expand it. So I'm wondering if we actually would realistically have this case where the build pack would find a packaged server.
That's a good point. This is really just a carryover from the Cloud Foundry Liberty build pack, where it would work from a Liberty package server. But I see your point. There would probably be an unarchived, would be an archived artifacts at that point. Okay.
Yeah, I think that makes sense in this context, but I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something here, like that I wasn't understanding.
No, yeah, I think you did. You do understand it correctly, and yeah, and I understand your comment.
Okay, great.
I can take that out or just elaborate more on what that means.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. You definitely want to support the case where people are building from one of these packaged things, but from just the perspective of the one component,
right,
you probably wouldn't find that situation.
Right.
Another thing I was wondering if we could elaborate on is sort of, we've said a Liberty server directory exists. But I think it would be nice in this RC to describe how we identify one of those.
Okay. Again, this is another carryover from the existing Cloud Foundry build pack on what that build pack would detect as something it would handle. So Liberty server directory it would be an on-prem Liberty server that you would push, or you would build with, and our detect would look for a specific directory structure. But yeah, I can elaborate on what that looks like in the RFC.
Like maybe part of this is something that the implementer who's a little bit more familiar with the details of Liberty would find obvious, but it's not something I find obvious. So I'd love to just see exactly how we would identify one of those applications, especially so we can make sure that we can distinguish between it and other artifact types.
Right, understand.
So the next question I had here, when we were talking about these different types of Liberty packages, does this imply that, so I think you've looked at sort of how these Buildpack tomls sort of list all the dependencies they're capable of installing.
Right.
We said we'd have like 2 versions of Open Liberty and 2 versions of Liberty, WebSphere Liberty.
Right.
Does supporting all of these package formats sort of mean that we end up with 14 different types of dependencies?
Well, I think I'm going to back off on having 2 versions of each for Open Liberty and WebSphere Liberty, and just have one release. But Liberty delivers archives of different types, profile 7 or web profile 7, web profile 8, whatever, Java EE7, Java EE8. And you can just utilize that one small part of Open Liberty and not install the entire server. So I think we would have 7. Let me count. See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'd probably have maybe 12 different different archives the Buildpack would install or contribute, and it would just be one of the 12 or so that are available.
I'm not implying that like 14 is too many or anything. The Buildpack can record as many URLs as it wants to go reach out to download things from. Just trying to make sure I'm sort of understanding all the different artifacts we would need.
And I'll elaborate on that, what that means, and be more specific about which ones are available for Open Liberty and which ones are available for WebSphere Liberty. And clearly define which one's going to be the default if you don't specify a package type.
That all makes sense.
Something else that you might want to consider is that you've got basically 2 servers into this build pack, and you could potentially split this into 2 build packs, and then you could have the detection process determine if you need the open source or the Liberty server based on your detection criteria and the provides that you set. It might just simplify some of the logic for you instead of doing the logic checks in your actual code pack, and the build pack tools will basically make those decisions for you.
Yeah. Okay. I'll look into that to see if that makes more sense.
Can you elaborate a little bit, Dan, sort of like how that could be determined by a downstream build pack?
I guess my thought is that they're both installing servers, so you could have them both do like a provides or something like that, and then just by determining the requires at some point, you would be able to kind of force that decision there. I haven't really thought it through, but I know we've done similar things elsewhere. So
I'm just curious sort of how you would know which one to require.
probably like a binding or something. I mean, that the license file seems like the key differentiator between, selecting open source or the commercial version. So yeah, the presence of that should be visible at detection time.
That makes sense. Okay. Speaking of the license file, I did have one comment here. I think it's when we have WebSphere Liberty that we need the license file. I think it might be worth elaborating in this RFC how we'll provide it, or how the user will provide it. It seems like it's the kind of thing that would go in a binding. And this is just my ignorance, but is it just needed during the install, the license file, or is it something that you need to provide to Liberty at runtime in order for it to execute?
Yeah, it's not needed at runtime, and it's really not needed at install time. But if you are using WebSphere Liberty, you're supposed to have a license, but I can't say that the code really enforces the presence of a license.
Okay, got it. So it's sort of like, that makes it interesting, right? Because it's we're like, this is how you provide the license that we then ignore, but you
Yeah.
should do it.
Yeah.
Maybe
That's-
like we don't need to elaborate on that if it's not required, but
Well, I think from Liberty's perspective, they would probably want to maybe somehow make sure a license is there. Then I'll talk with the head Liberty architect to see what he would like us to do. 'Cause, you know, we do look for a license in the Cloud Foundry build pack. Or really just a license code that you would have to have a license to know what that license code is. I mean, we could do something similar. Just look for a license code in an environment variable, and if it's there, assume it's what's for Liberty.
Some maybe food for thought on the license as well, because a big change between the V2 build packs and V3 is we have to be really careful about writing the license file into a configuration file at build time or to the image, because we don't necessarily want that sensitive info in the image itself.
Okay.
So you'll see in a lot of the other build packs, there are these helper programs that run. And what those do is they run like before the application starts in the runtime image, and they'll usually take that license from like a binding or something and then write it to the file kind of at the last possible minute, you know,
Okay.
wherever it needs to go on disk.
Okay.
but it sounds like maybe the license isn't used at runtime.
It's not.
Yeah, we could like,
It's kind of like on the honor system.
I'm curious in the Cloud Foundry build pack right now, like I noticed that you're setting it in an environment variable.
Yeah.
Does it do anything with the value of that environment variable?
There is a check to make sure that that value in the variable matches the license key that is for that version of WebSphere or that version of WebSphere Liberty.
That makes sense. That
And
seems
then-
like something where we could recreate that at, if we provided it in a
Yeah.
build time binding, we could
Yeah.
run that check.
And the check isn't really done with the Liberty server archive or code itself. It's kind of like a checking a website to see if those two codes match. And that's all done by the build pack. It's not done by Liberty at all.
Maybe it sounds like you can check with the Liberty folks and figure out
Yep.
what they want us to do there.
Yep.
Since we're not distributing any of these versions of Liberty through Paketo, we're just distributing something that's capable of downloading it. I don't think we'll get ourselves in any trouble by not checking the license, but I would like to make sure that like to do the right thing.
Sure. Understood.
Yeah.
I'll investigate that more and then elaborate on what I find out talking to the Liberty architecture team and document that in the RFC.
That sounds great. I did investigate some of the legal questions that we said we'd talk about before. And given sort of we already have something that replicates this behavior in the CFF, in that Cloud Foundry community build pack, I don't think adding this doesn't seem like there's anything special about the way we'd be doing this in Paketo that changes the calculus there. So
Okay.
I think as long as we're not bundling these assets and shipping them in an asset package or an offline build pack, we should be a-okay on that front.
Okay, cool.
My final question was, I was glancing over some of the Liberty documentation, and it seems like a lot of the workflows recommended installing Liberty sort of with the application build tool, like with Maven or Gradle. Wondering if we thought about how that intersects with the build pack, like if an application is doing this, can we still get a successful build where the build pack that would have installed Liberty contributes the right process type, but doesn't install Liberty? Is this a case we should be thinking about?
I really wasn't thinking about using Maven or Gradle to install Liberty at all. Just using Gradle or Maven to compile the app, just like the Java build pack does, and still rely on the build pack to download the version of Liberty.
I can definitely see that being sort of our recommended, or even in the beginning, the only workflow we support. I just noticed that enough types of the documentation sort of even listed that as the first example of how to fetch these things. So if there was an easy way such that, maybe Liberty users who already have this configuration in their Maven and Gradle file could move to Paketo Buildpacks without having to change their app or how they're building locally, I think that would be a nice thing.
Okay. Yeah. That's something we could probably investigate and implement. But that'd probably be something we would add later.
Yeah, I'm totally okay calling it out of scope for now. I just was curious, sort of, like if someone was using this Maven tool, would they, be getting a Liberty packaged server that has Liberty in it already? Sort of, how does that work?
Well, I think typically in the POM file, one of the dependencies would be a Liberty server, and it would install Liberty, build the app, install whatever dependencies, and that would be a working on-prem solution, or a working on-prem application. I don't know if any of their documentation provide a way to build like a Docker image using a POM file. I bet they do, but I'm not really aware if they do. And then similarly with Gradle, it's and I'm less familiar with Gradle than I am with Maven. So whatever if Gradle has an equivalent of a POM file, it would do the same thing. Install Liberty as a dependency when it's building the app.
I was sort of curious, like in this case, what the what type of artifact comes out the other end, because we're sort of talking about, if someone pushes a package server application, then we install Liberty and run the application with the Liberty we installed. If you're sort of installing Liberty as part of the build, does it end up in your packaged application? Does it just end up on the system next to it? Like
I think the package server is kind of misleading. The package server is a concept, is a Liberty concept, which it basically just archives the app and the config, but not the runtime. So I can see the confusion because it's how they decided to name that function a package server. It's really not a server at all. It is just an app and a configuration.
Server application.
Yeah.
Which is sort of how I was understanding it. It made sense. But then when I saw that you could install Liberty via the build tool, my question was sort of like, where? Like I'm used to like Maven generating, you know, as a zip archive or a jar or a war, or I could imagine it, you know, with certain plugins generating a special zip archive that's a packaged Liberty application. I'm just not quite sure where it puts Liberty if it's installing Liberty.
I think you can define that in the POM file where to install. But it's the directory structure for Liberty and how it looks for its config and its an application. It's pretty much set. You can't deviate from that directory structure. Like there's a Liberty home directory and everything is off of that. You know, there's a bin directory which has all the binaries. There's a user directory. That's where the app and the config is. And that's really all a package server contained is stuff down the Liberty home user directory tree that would just have the config in the app.
That makes sense. So maybe for now we can just call using the version of Liberty that was installed by Maven out of scope, and like we will reinstall. And then we could leave it as an exercise for the future to figure out,
Yep.
you know, how we could integrate these things more nicely.
Yep. Okay. I thank you for your comments, and I will make some updates to the RFC. Hopefully by next work group meeting.
Thanks for answering all my questions and putting up with my ignorance of Liberty. Okay. That's all I had on that topic. And we don't seem to have anything else on the agenda for today. Was there anything else folks wanted to talk about while we're all here?
I had a quick question. Where did we end up on the RFC to co-locate all Paketo RFCs? Is that approved? Are we implementing that? Should future RFCs open in the centralized location?
Great question. Looks like we merged the RFC to collocate all Paketo RFCs. Looks like Ryan merged it 12 days ago. So we should co-locate all the Paketo RFCs. Maybe we should talk about how to do that for existing ones. Does each sub team want to take the action to move over their sub team RFCs?
Is there something in the RFC about how we intended to implement it? Like what would be the action from maintainers according to the RFC?
Probably. Let me go open it up here for a second. I can share this. Oh, the readable link is broken, which is what happens when you merge and don't update it. Hold on. Okay. So let's rediscover what this says. It looks like we need to create team directories in the text directory, which makes sense. Says they should be moved and removed. I don't think we've outlined a process for who owns that. We do need to create a code owners file probably before we could start moving things across. And it seems like that is something that we would need to approve with the existing permission structure. So Ryan or I could approve and merge that, but then after that's merged, then folks should be able to, sub-teams should be able to move their RFCs over and approve and merge them themselves. Sort of my understanding. If we started with the code owners file and the directory structure, then we should have the permissions in place.
Okay, so first step is get this code owners file created. Yeah.
Yep.
Is that something that you want to do, or should someone PR that in?
If someone would like to PR it in, I would be happy to let someone else do it. Otherwise, it might take me a bit of time to get to it because I will be in a parade of meetings. But if no one else gets to it, I can do it by the end of day today. Sounds like I can just take that if no one else is really eager to do it. I guess Ryan created an issue here, which is nice. It is also nice that this basically says exactly what we just said. So it seems like everyone's on the same page. Anything else that we want to say on that topic? Any other late breaking topics? Going once, going twice. All right, folks. Have a good day.